Okay, I'm Suzanne Denitz, and we are doing a Religious Lives interview on February 25th, 2011, and I am here with Doug to do the interview in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay, we're going to first talk about your faith in your childhood, and really what we're wanting here is stories. So if you have a nice, you'll talk to people sometime and you go, oh, well, that's a long story. That's the story we want. so we really want some stories. So if you could talk about what your earliest memories were concerning your faith in childhood.
Sure. Well, one of the first memories that I have as a child was my introduction to faith. Faith was always a part of my family life growing up. It was we attended worship services on a regular basis in the small town that I grew up in North Louisiana, and faith has been a part of our family heritage back to my great-grandfather, that I remember stories and histories. My great-grandfather was well known in our denomination, and for me as a child growing up, he was kind of a hero, a faith hero, my great-grandfather. And one of my first memories as a child was my baptism. I grew up in a Christian home, and when I was about 8 years old, I was baptized. And for people that are from a Christian perspective, the baptism is an outward expression of the inner experience. So when I was 8, I was baptized along with my sister. I'll give you a visual.
All right.
This is my sister that is 18 months older than I am, and my other sister who is 3 years older than I am.
Cute picture.
Yeah, thank you. My parents had 3 children in 36 months, and my mom had a miscarriage in between Brenda, the middle child, and myself. This, of course, we're talking about the early 50s. My parents married in 1951, and Debbie, my sister, was born in 52, and Brenda was born in 54, and I was born in 55. So one of my first experiences, back to your question, was my baptism, and Brenda, my middle sister, and I were baptized at the same time. And I remember that just as well as yesterday. In fact, I went back home, been back home several times in Louisiana, but I went back home a couple years ago for Debbie's funeral. Wow. And it was in that same congregation.
Really?
Yeah, and it was the baptism where Brenda and I were baptized was behind me, and I was asked to speak at my sister Debbie's funeral. It was a faith crisis. It was a crisis of faith because Debbie, at about age 55, had a tumor in her leg. She was being treated at MD Anderson, and the tumor eventually went to her brain, and we just watched her slowly decline.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was quite an experience. And for me, it was a grief experience. Of course, I didn't mention this, but I work as a pastoral counselor, and I also am licensed as a marriage and family therapist. So when I'm doing good work, I'm able to integrate both faith and practice. So I take spirituality, faith, I take it very seriously. And I'm always interested as I get to know folks, and most of the people that I see are people of faith. I get most of my referrals from clergy. That was kind of my entree into the field of mental health, is that my father was a physician. I mentioned that earlier, and it was kind of the expectation in my family that I would be a physician. But I decided my freshman year in college that I wanted to do something that was faith-related in my work. And so I went to seminary. I didn't know exactly what that was. I thought I would work in a local parish. But I went to seminary, and then I worked as a chaplain at a hospital in Dallas. And it was while I was working as a chaplain, and then also I worked in a parish for a little while as an associate. I began working with single adults, and I had the theological education, but I really didn't have the clinical training. So I went back and to a pastoral counseling center there in Dallas.
Can we go back just to your childhood?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Can you just put all this on?
Okay.
It's great. I just kind of want to get some of these.
Yes. Well, what are some specifics about the childhood?
Some specifics. Was it a full immersion baptism?
It was. That's a good question. Yes, it was.
And do you remember what you were wearing, or who immersed you, or
I remember,
what you felt?
I do. I remember that James Edward was the pastor that baptized me, and I do not remember what I wore. What people wear, what they currently wear is some kind of robe. So I'm assuming that I wore some kind of robe or some kind of garment. But it's a baptismal pool. I don't know if you have ever been in a Baptist church or not, but it's actually water. Mm-hmm. And the symbolism of the baptism is that we're buried with Christ in baptism, and then when they bring you up, the ministry says raised to walk in newness of life. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened to me. But I was 8, and so it was it was faith of an 8-year-old. Mm-hmm. And wow, my faith has just transpired so much through the years. It's amazing, but it was the beginning point. Mm-hmm.
What denomination was this?
Baptist.
Okay.
Yeah, Baptist. And keep in mind, both my mom and my dad come from Baptist traditions, and the great grandfather that I mentioned to you earlier, he was Baptist. So Baptist is a part of our experience growing up.
What was it about your great grandfather that was such an influence on you?
Well, he was a wise person. He was a well-educated man. He had a doctorate in theology. He was also a leader, and in our denomination, he was the president of the convention. He was in the United States. He was the number one person.
Yeah.
To me, as a child, that was just so cool.
Right. To
see that, and he was educated. He was a leader. He was a spiritual man. I have some. That's his academic hood right here. That I have in my office. This is his academic hood.
Oh wow.
Yeah, isn't that something?
Yeah.
And in my home, I have.
Still looks new.
I know. That's my academic hood.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do actually wear that occasionally. In my home, I also have some belongings of his that are that I still treasure. So, I guess I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
I never do. He died in what year did he die? He died probably in 62 or so. I don't know when he died, but it's probably 60. Well, I don't know when he died. It's before 62, so I was 6 or 7, and I don't. Only I remember about that experience was we were in the backyard, sodding our backyard, and my dad, he was born in he was in his 30s. He was in his early 30s. They came and told us that great grandfather died, and that's about my only memory. So I don't really remember him.
Yeah.
But his image is his presence.
His presence
is very powerful in my life.
What were some of the practices at home? I assume you went to church.
We did go to church regularly. Giving was very important in my family growing up. Tithing, I don't know if you know the word tithing or not, but it was, and I grew up in a family where money was not something that we worried about. Provisions were made. Provisions were given. So I always had money to give because my physical needs were always being met. Mm-hmm. And so as a child, I always enjoyed giving, and I found a lot of blessing. The scripture says it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I experienced that. Now, my food was taken care of and my education was taken care of, so I I didn't have to worry about my necessities. So I was blessed in the sense that I was able to give. Now I know sometimes people don't have food, and sometimes people have to pay for education. Well, all that was provided for me. So giving has always been. We went to church regularly. We gave, and we prayed at home. I remember sitting in my dad's lap and reading my Sunday school lesson as a child. And then two faith people that were really instrumental in my life were my mother's mother, whom we call Granny, and also Mary, whose picture I showed you a minute ago. She was a very committed Christian, and she, in some ways, was...
she was your nanny.
She was our nanny. I called her nanny.
Yeah.
I called her. That's what I called her. And she didn't have any children of her own, and she was so proud of me and used to call me her baby, and she would carry a picture of me in her wallet.
Oh, how sweet.
Oh yeah, and she'd ride the bus. And when I was 15, I learned how to drive. In Louisiana, you could drive 15. Well, she was so determined by seeing me drive that she wanted to drive. She wanted to learn how to drive. So once I got my driver's license at 15, she got her driver's license, and then she got her car, and so she was really proud of that. But I grew up in the South. I grew up.
Did you go to private school or public
No, I
school?
went to very intentional about going to public school. Right, I was right in the middle of integration, segregation, integration, all that. Oh, it was a mess, and it was. Oh wow! I remember in middle school we had a black girl. That was the first black student that I'd ever seen. Was when I was in the 7th grade. Her name was Dorothy, and then Dexter came. And while that was in middle school, junior high, and then by the time we were in high school, we were fully integrated. But and there was a private school there, and I got pressure to go to a private school, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay at a public school.
Do you remember when you were young, if in your public school, if they said prayers, if there was any reference to the Bible?
We did. I do remember. That's a good question. The Gideons used to come to our school in elementary school and give us Bibles. Remember the little Bibles?
I do. Yeah. Those tiny little ones, yeah.
I do remember that. In high school, we paused for a moment of silence. They didn't call it prayer, but people could pray if they wanted to. That's an interesting question. It was not really public. See, I come from a faith tradition that believes strongly in the separation of church and state.
You do?
I do. And that's one of a strong beliefs in my denomination and in my perspective is that there needs to be a strong separation of church and state. And the reason I believe that is that, my preference is to pray in Christ's name. So I wouldn't want someone from another faith perspective to enforce their prayer on me. So my preference is the separation of church and state, and let the church be the church, and the state do what it needs to do. But anyway, that's I did go to a private college. I went to Baylor University in Texas, and then went to Baptist seminaries.
Okay. And when you were a child, did you think about religion, or was it more something that you participated in just because it was normal, just because this is what your family was doing?
I really thought about it, and I was kind of I had a faith bent or spiritual bent as a child, and I don't know how to describe that, but I just had a leaning toward matters of faith or spirituality, even at a young age, and I'm sure my family system impacted that to some degree. And I will say this: the church, as a high school student, was very meaningful to me. The church was to me like a surrogate family, and I got a lot of, and which had a lot to do with my decision to study for the ministry, because I got a lot of affirmation and validation from these family of families, which is my way of thinking about the church. They saw in me some leadership gifts and also some spiritual gifts, I think, that they affirmed. And so it seemed natural for me, although I will say this, my father being a physician, he had a hard time with my decision to go into the ministry, but it was, it was a shoo-in for me to practice medicine. It was just, he had an office, he inherited a medical practice from his uncle that died when he was in his early 30s, and my dad just inherited all of the practice, as well as the patients, as well as so it was just a shoo-in. But anyway, I really felt like that I felt a call to do ministry, and I do still feel a call to do the work. People that sit where you sit, I work as a pastoral counselor, and the depth of what people talk about to me is very sacred, and there's a richness about that. But I will say this, it can be very dark at times. Okay. But that's more as an adult.
Yeah,
you want to stay with the children, the child, right?
You're so funny. You remind me of my son. When my son was born, you looked at him and you thought, he just wants to be an adult. He just wants to be an adult. He's like, I want to skip over all this childhood stuff. He's an adult.
But what I believe, Suzanne, is that it's the childhood experience that impacts the adult experience.
Well, tell me just a little bit about you've already touched on it, but your adolescent and teenage years, because sometimes, some kids go through a lot during this period. So just talk about how it was for you in relation to your faith.
Okay, adolescent and teenage years. I guess I would have to say that part of my challenge was, the psychobabble word would be individuation, where I was trying to figure out who I was separate and apart from the family. Mm-hmm. And so I manifested a lot of anger. I didn't know this at the time, but I manifested a lot of anger and resentment. I had resentment for several things, but it was kind of, as I look back on it, it was kind of my way to become my own person that was connected to my family, but also separate. Mm-hmm. I grew up, I would say I grew up on the wealthier side of the tracks. And there were times in my adolescence that I felt very guilty about that, and which probably impacted my motivation to give. Wow. Yeah. So part of my individuation was trying to, and since I have been able to affirm that, I don't feel the anger that I did, but the anger helped me become my own self, if that makes sense. So it helped give me some distance. Because my family did grow up with what I would consider to be a lot of excess, a lot of non-essential fluff. So as an adolescent, I had an interest in people that didn't have fluff and didn't have excess.
And this was during the 60s.
Yeah, well, late 60s. Mm-hmm. I was in high school in 69 and I graduated in 73. Mm-hmm. So high school for me, yeah, you're right, late 60s, early 70s. And so I remember in college I had real mission and energy in the ministry to people in Bangladesh and people that were hungry. And in
physically hungry.
Physically hungry. Yeah, good question. And then in my adolescence, I had real interest for people. In my home church, we had a care and share clothes closet, and I had investment and energy in helping people that didn't have clothes. So part of my faith was, I guess it was unique in the sense that I had a heart, and I still have this heart, had a heart for people that didn't have some of the necessities of life. And now I find myself being attuned and invested in people that are dealing with spiritual issues. So, that's more as an adult, though.
Yeah. Well, she did good. So did you ever, did you keep going to church regularly? Did you keep praying? Was your family still involved in church?
No, they are not.
School?
That's interesting. That's a good question.
Or through high school?
There has been a lot of changes in my congregation. I just grieve this very much. This congregation that I mentioned, where Debbie, Brenda, and I were baptized, and my two sisters were married in that congregation, and I was ordained in that congregation. It has been. They just asked the pastor to leave. It's dwindled down to nothing, and I just grieve that so much. And so my sister died in '08, and my other sister lives in that small town, North Louisiana, and she worships at another congregation, and my parents don't worship there. And my parents are both in their 80s, and they don't worship anywhere. They have, even as recent as this last visit, they have really come to the place where they don't feel like they really identify with what is more typically known as the Baptist tradition. Yeah, and Baptists have gone through so much through the years.
We're going to come back to your adolescence, but this is very interesting since they're in their 80s. When did they first start feeling like this?
I would say in the last dozen years or so. Baptists have gone through significant identity changes, and he's evolved around a lot of different topics and issues, and some of it evolves around the issue of sexual identity, gay type questions, heterosexual, homosexual issues. For some, it's around the issue of authority, and particularly women. There are some Baptists that don't believe in the ordination of women. So they really haven't felt any sense of community, and it's kind of sad for me because they're in their aging years of life. They have significant health issues, and they don't really have any regular community of faith.
Well, when you were a teenager, they were still going to church.
Yeah,
assuming,
and my dad was actually a deacon, and he was chairman of the deacons at one time. And my dad was very civic minded too. He was the physician for the local children's home, and it's a children's home a Baptist home, Louisiana Baptist Children's Home, and it's a home for children that they aren't orphans. They don't have parents that can take care of them. So they live in this home. So for 55 years, he was the physician. That's one of my vivid memories as a child. It was kind of interesting, and I've said this to my dad before, but he, in some ways, was a minister. He was a physician, and he was also a minister, which was kind of interesting. He served people. And so I used to work in his office, and I got educated about what I call ministry from a very early age, because I'd work with him in his office on Saturdays as a child, and then as a middle schooler and as a high schooler, and he would pay me, so I watched him work, and I watched him minister to people and families, and he was very skilled at that. I admire him very much.
Nice. Well, tell me a little bit about going into college. You said there was an issue with you went to Baylor to study.
I did. I went to a Methodist school in Texas. Got terribly homesick, so I went back home and went to school at a state university for a couple years, and then eventually went to Baylor, which was a great experience. I had a wonderful experience at Baylor, and majored in sociology, but I knew when I was in sociology that I wanted to eventually go to seminary. It was hard for me to leave home. It was hard because it was I don't know. My individuation process is a part of my learning experience, and fortunately, I was able to navigate that. But faith continued to be a very important part of my experience, and even in college, I was very active in my local church, and had a mind for ministry, and did mission trips and all that kind of thing.
Were your thoughts about religion changing? Have they changed a lot since you were a child or an adolescent?
Well, I tell you when it changed particularly. It changed particularly, Suzanne, when my wife and I went through infertility.
Oh.
And it changed particularly as I watched my sister die. And Sally and I were married, and we wanted a child, and we prayed for a child, and our prayers just just went unanswered. And as a pastor and as a young student, I was in my early 30s. I had a hard time making sense out of that. So my way of dealing with my grief is that I went back to school and got another degree, and my emphasis was on pastoral counseling with couples dealing with infertility. So what I was interested in studying was what are churches saying to the 1 in 6 couples that deal with infertility.
1 in 6.
1 in 6. That's pretty high.
That's very high.
And many congregations don't voice the word. So I was interested in what churches were interested, what they were doing to minister to the 1 in 6 couples, and I was also interested in how the infertility grief experience impacted the marital relationship. How couples, as male and female, dealt with grief and loss, and the spiritual faith issues. It's a developmental life cycle crisis, but it's also a faith crisis. So in my own journey, my faith has been enriched and broadened and deepened in the darkest moments of my life. And it's in the infertility, and also in the experience of the death of my sister, as I tried as best I could to make sense out of that experience that really, in many ways, it's hard to make sense out of. So it was in those moments that faith was strengthened.
Can you explain that? Is it you felt a comfort, a surrender, an answer? I mean, what?
Well, I tell you that one of the most helpful. This might sound preachy, but it's been helpful to me. What's the most helpful way of thinking about the way that God works in our lives has been by a minister and theologian and pastor and professor by the name of John Claypool. He talks about the way that God works in our life, and he talks about 3 ways, and I'll be very quick.
Take your time.
God sometimes creates a miracle, so he does the out of the ordinary. Sometimes he collaborates with the oncologist, he collaborates with the reproductive endocrinologist, or he collaborates with the cardiologist, or whatever. There are other ways that he collaborates in our life. But the third way, which is a part of what was so helpful for me, is that he gives us sufficient grace to live by faith. Which means that he could create a miracle, but for whatever reason, no miracle happens. He could collaborate, but for whatever reason, collaboration doesn't happen. But he gives us faith to live by sufficient grace. Paul said, "My grace is sufficient." Paul had, this is another biblical image that's been very powerful for me and important to my own journey, is that Paul prayed about something that irritated him, what the scripture says is his thorn in the flesh. And he prayed 3 times, the scripture says, and the answer was, "My grace is sufficient." So part of my experience in my own life and part of my experience, which is so rich with couples and families and individuals that I work with, is how do we walk by faith in a way that we can live life by faith when life doesn't really make sense.
Are you saying that, I'm just trying to clarify my own mind here, that having faith that this is the will of God, or just having faith that for whatever reason you're infertile, you'll be able to go on? Do you see a distinction there?
Yes. That's a good question. I would say, well, I don't know if this answers your question, but here's what I think sometimes about the tears of God, which is to say that if the scripture from the Old Testament says, be fruitful and multiply, for whatever reason, the body is not working the way that it was created to work. So sometimes it's a genetic predisposition, sometimes we know about a third of the infertility. I think it's about a third are male factor, a third are female factor, and then a third are what they would call unexplained. Sometimes they don't even know. So when I sit with couples that are trying to get pregnant, I did a group Wednesday night, and I had 13 people here. There were 7 different couples, and they all want a child, and they're not pregnant. So I was sitting with them, and I've said some of the things that I'm saying to you here as they're trying to make sense. One, and I won't go on because it's. But anyway, I have a heart for people that, I guess it's because of my medical background from my father, but I do a lot of work with families dealing with aging. I have a heart for ministry to families impacted by cancer. I have a heart for couples dealing with infertility. And it's what I think of as the practical theology or the applied theology of pastoral care. I feel called to do that. Mm-hmm. And my spirituality of my own experience, it's interesting as I tell my story, it's my own experience that has impacted my ministry that I offer to couples and families.
Wow.
Is that too preachy?
No, I don't think it was preachy at all. I had this thought. Do you think you were talking about the 3 ways that God answers?
Yeah, to me that's been so helpful.
Yeah.
Because you see, the first one is the exciting way, where a miracle happens. The second one is great too, and praise God, the oncologist is able to help us out. The third way is a less traveled way.
Well, do you think that there have to be different levels of faith to accept each one of these ways? Like this... I'll put it on a really gross level. Do you think God gives the miracles to the people whose faith isn't deep enough to accept it? I mean, have you ever thought about it that way as a striated level of understanding?
I would think that God, the provisions of God's grace is available for all. That's the way I would think about it. Now, some access it more readily. That's interesting because Sally and I we eventually were able to conceive on our own.
Yeah, I see pictures.
Just a brief story about how that happened. We were working with a gynecologist here in Atlanta, and we took a break from our medical treatment. And she said, "You can't get pregnant for 6 months. Come back in 6 months." Well, it was during that break that on our own, we conceived my daughter, who is a junior in college right now. So in my Bible, I don't have my Bible with me, but I still have a picture of my wife and my daughter on the day that she was born, because that was such a powerful manifestation of the goodness of God. And I say that with reluctance, because what do you say to the couple that prayed for a child and doesn't have a child? So I think of it as a blessing of God, but then I'm reluctant to say that, because does that mean that the couple that doesn't have a child, that they're cursed by God? I don't think that. But that's what the couple feels. The Old Testament way of thinking about sterility, barrenness, the Old Testament talked about barrenness. But a lot of times the Old Testament notion was it was a curse of God, which I think is common with our culture, that a lot of times these couples that I sit with, they feel cursed by God. And that's not the way I think. I don't think of it as a barrenness as a curse of God, particularly in light of the fact that Scripture says, be fruitful and multiply. So anyway, how do you integrate faith, relational health? All of that, to me, is very fascinating.
Very complicated.
Yeah, very complicated. Very complicated.
Well, how do you, as an adult, so you said that these things really changed the way that you think about God and changed your faith. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, let's see.
Because I know they changed your trajectory. But
I think I used to be more idealistic, and but maybe just about life in general. And as I have sat with hundreds of folks, life is painful. At times it's dark, and maybe my population that I see is skewed. People that come into my office, I often say, Suzanne, people don't come here when things are going well. Divorce or internet pornography or addiction or death in the family or death of a child or whatever. That's usually the entree for people that come to talk to me. I have a minister friend. He always jokes me. He said, no one ever comes to you when things are going well, and he's got some truth to that. Usually there's something that precipitates that. So the way my faith as an adult has changed, I think I'm much more realistic. And as I sit with married couples, I find myself saying this often. And the research from John Gottman would validate what I'm saying, is that some things just don't change. All married couples have what we call unsolvable differences. Things that just don't change.
That's nice to know.
I know it is It is nice to know. But you know what this is John Gottman's research. What differentiates the healthy couples from the unhealthy couples is that the unhealthy couples argue and bicker and complain and gripe about the unsolvable differences. The healthy couples seem to be able to live at peace with those things that don't change. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's pretty
cool.
pretty significant research that John Gottman, who is a fantastic researcher and Jewish in his faith, has helped me as I work with couples in their relationship and their faith. To me, that's been very helpful to help couples see and recognize that some things just don't change. And by the way, theologically and faith related, that whole principle for me is encapsulated in the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity. You know that prayer? Yeah. That Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote that prayer, which is the prayer of AA and any 12-step program, is that God would help me to change the things that I can do something about, and the wisdom to know the difference between the things that I can't do anything about and the things that I can. Mm-hmm. I love that prayer because it talks about living by faith. I love that. That means so much to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know much about alcoholic families, but people that are in alcoholic families, oh man, I see that so much, and it's just so painful to see that and to witness that. And I find myself holding on to that truth that spiritual truth as well as relational truth, as well as solid theological thinking, that God would help me to focus on the things that I can do something about, because honestly there's some things that I can't do a thing about. And walking by faith, to me, is learning to live with that reality and that tension.
Mm-hmm. You speak a lot about God helping you, but there's a lot of individuation. I think you made it. I think you did it, and there's a lot of.
Well, I'm still doing it. I'm still doing it.
You know, kind of a responsibility.
Yes.
In like you're responsible, and you're not just. It doesn't sound like you're just depending on God to solve all of your problems.
I like the prayer that says, God, that I pray as though everything depends upon me, and I trust God and pray as though everything depends upon Him. So that, I think that's helpful to think about. Okay, in other words, it's an active faith. Mm-hmm. I think it was an active, applied faith. Mm-hmm. And I tell these couples that are going through infertility, your job is to do the best you can, and sometimes couples don't even want to talk to the reproductive endocrinologist. Mm-hmm. I have several couples that they think that's meddling with God. Well, my thought is that God can use the reproductive endocrinologist.
Mm-hmm. And were you pretty much raised with that thought, as opposed to
I grew up in a
predetermination? Yeah,
I grew up in a family where medical access of medical care was just kind of a given. Mm-hmm. So that was and I worked in a hospital setting. As a young pastor and young chaplain, and I was born in a Catholic hospital in Louisiana, and that's where my dad worked all of his medical career, was in that. Mm-hmm. It's a fantastic Catholic hospital.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Wow. Well, what today, and like through your adulthood, what have been the religious practices that have sustained you? Do you still go to church?
Yeah, worship, prayer.
How do you pray, if you don't mind me asking?
No, I don't mind. To me, it's just an ongoing dialogue. It's not real formal. It's very experiential and in the moment. Mm-hmm. And I find myself praying when I'm in my work. Some people want me to do a formal prayer, and sometimes I do that. But as I'm talking with people, I'm aware of the presence of God. Mm-hmm. And so. How do I pray? I just pray that God would help me to be attentive to His presence as the gift that I offer. I'm doing most of the talking today, but the gift that I offer, the ministry that I offer, is in the pastoral care, the listening, the respecting, the caring, as I sit with folks and try to help them make sense out of their life. Mm-hmm. In a way that works for them.
Okay.
I like to give too. I still like to give.
You still like to give?
We had this ministry at the church across the street, which I think was so cool. It was called Souls for Souls, and it was a collection of shoes for this ministry called Souls for Souls. And I got so fired up and excited about it. When I went back home to Louisiana, I wrote my parents and my nieces and my sister, and I brought back 4 bags of shoes. So I like doing stuff. I just got so fired up about doing stuff like that. To me, that's kind of applied theology. Mm-hmm. Where, I have plenty of shoes.
Yeah.
So I'm giving to others that don't have shoes.
Have you had any particular, like, just spiritual experiences, you know, that we haven't discussed yet? Maybe cosmic, you know.
Let's see. Any spiritual experiences?
Like any, you know, any major, like experiential type things.
Yeah, let's see. I find that I have those in my work.
Powerful religious, spiritual experiences.
Okay.
Yeah. Some people would call them miracles.
That people call miracles?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know why I'm thinking about this one couple that they live in Mississippi, and I helped them through a difficult time 20 years ago, and this one couple sends me a Christmas card every Advent.
Wow.
And it's moments like that and they say, I mean, she says periodically through these years that it was my being with them that was so formative in their own experience that they were on the brink of divorce. And let's see. Let me come back to that.
Okay. When was your first interaction with someone of a different faith? And did this have an impact on you?
I grew up with a lot of folks of a variety of faiths. I grew up in a small Louisiana town where there were a lot of Jewish people, and a lot of my friends in high school were Presbyterian, and of course I was active in my youth group. They were all similar to me, but a lot of my friends growing up were Presbyterian, and then in college I was at a Baptist college. So I'd say Jewish, and I don't have a lot of interaction with people of other faiths. And I guess that's part of that is that I'm a minister of a Christian denomination, so most of my interfacings are people of like-minded. So I don't have... Now, I'm on the panel of providers for this large reproductive practice, and I do periodically get... And the couples have to come to a social worker, marriage and family therapist, licensed professional counselor to do IVF. And so I'm on that panel. So sometimes most of those people that I get are people that are people of similar faith, but sometimes I do get people that are Hindu or Buddhist come, but it's only that one interview. Mm-hmm. It's a one-time shot type deal. So to answer your question, I really don't have a lot of interaction with a lot of people of other faiths.
When you were in college, did you take any courses on any other religions?
That's a good question. No, but in seminary, in graduate school, I did, and we had a class that was on world religions, mm-hmm. but it was only like one semester. Mm-hmm. It wasn't very extensive.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't really, honestly, I don't know a whole lot
about other religions. Are there any traditions or any practices outside of being a Baptist that you draw upon for your spiritual or your mental health? Any outside of your primary religion?
Okay, let's think about that. Well, I look to behavioral. So I look mental health, behavioral sciences. I mean, I mentioned John Gottman. He's kind of a respected. I don't know. I met him one time, but his research has influenced me significantly. And so his faith is Jewish, but the material that he offers for from his research is on couples relationships. So I, as a Christian, have incorporated his research in a way that works for me.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
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 So I'm open-minded.
You're open-minded. Okay. Sounds like it.
Yeah.
And so you.
I'm for whatever works. Here's what I love this memory. We get consultation from psychiatrists, and it's part of my discipline. And there's a well-known psychiatrist. He was a analyst, and he taught at Emory, I think, and he at one time taught at the Menninger Clinic, which is a well-known psychiatric clinic in Missouri, I believe. But anyway, I remember consulting with him about a client that I had, and she was into herbal teas. And so I took that to the supervision of this psychiatrist, and I never will forget what Dr. Ganzerain said. He said, "Well, I'm for whatever works." And so I like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it works, more power be to you.
Yeah.
So I tend to be more open-minded.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're using secular methodologies.
Right.
And yeah.
If it works.
If it works. Well, let me ask you one more thing about when you and your wife finally were able to have a child. Was that a miracle to you? I mean, was that a reward? Was that, how did you see that?
I think of it as that's an interesting question, because if you substitute the word miracle with blessing, I'm reluctant. I struggle with that, because what do we say to the couple that has no response?
Right.
Now, I felt blessed. I can't imagine. I don't know if you have children, but I cannot imagine not having children. We have an older couple in the congregation across the street. They've been married 60 years. They don't have any children. They're getting older, and to me, I just can't. And then we have another woman in the congregation, just had a stroke. She's in her 50s. She doesn't have any children. I grieve for those people. I don't know. But anyway, I think of it, for me personally, the fact that we were able to conceive, I consider it to be a miracle, because my sperm count was next to nothing, and my wife had difficulty ovulating. I know it.
Double whammy.
I know it. And so I think of it as a miracle, and that's why the picture of on March the 5th that was taken of my wife and my daughter is in the front of my Bible, because I see that as a sacred visualization of the goodness and mercy of God. Now, I'm saying that to you, but I say that with reluctance because of my sensitivity to those who...
Right.
So, yeah, right. So it's interesting it's an interesting question.
Yeah, yeah. And so do you think that faith is not having to understand why?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Can you give me your...
It's like Paul said, there's a lot of speculations about what the thorn was. Are you familiar with that passage?
No, I'm not.
He prayed. You can look it up, but if you just Google thorn in the flesh. But he prayed, and he prayed on 3 different occasions. Some people think it was medical. Some people thought he had some kind of mental complication. But it's not really clear what the thorn in the flesh is. You've heard the expression thorn in the flesh? Okay. Well, that's what something bothered him or irritated him. And the response was, my grace is sufficient. So I think part of walking by faith is learning that there are some things that just don't change,
Mm-hmm.
and you live life in that tension.
Okay. Oh, I like that. Yeah, in the tension.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you see yourself in relation with other people that practice your faith? Do you see differences, similarities? And then how do you see the Baptist faith as a part kind of the Atlanta community?
Well, Baptists have pretty. They have a lot of people don't understand Baptists, and I guess you could maybe say that about Catholics. A lot of people don't understand Catholics, but we are kind of known as being judgmental and conservative and preachy. I don't see myself as that. So there are parts about being Baptist that I like. Priesthood of the believer is one tenet that I hold to, and that is that in terms of my faith and my spirituality, the priesthood of the believer means that I individually have access to God. I don't have to go through someone else, a clergy or anybody else. So the tenet, it would be priesthood of the believer. To me, that's very important because it's an individual relationship. It's an individual process. So in terms of, by the way, sometimes I'm embarrassed to say that I'm Baptist because of the stereotypical way that we are portrayed. But I don't see myself as a Baptist Christian. I don't see myself fitting into that. A lot of people don't want to come talk to me because they are concerned that I'm going to preach to them or tell them what to do, and that's not my way of working with people. I don't do that. It's just not. I don't think it's sound clinically, and I don't think it's sound theologically either. So, in some ways, I tend to be different than some. Some would say that I'm more liberal, but yet my roots are from a conservative tradition. So it's interesting when you think about individuation. I think of that not only in terms of family, but also in terms of faith. And I have a book on my shelf. It's called "Growing Up to God." And I see that as a developmental journey that ebbs and flows throughout the life cycle of life, and I don't know. It's interesting how, and this is the way my brain works, is how faith, mental health, relational health, spirituality, to me, they all are parts of the fabric of the same cloth. And that's what I value in my work, is the integration of all of those. And as a person of faith, some therapists or psychologists or social workers wouldn't want to integrate faith into their work. They would choose to separate faith from their work. I don't impose my faith on people that I see, but if that's something that they want to talk about, I welcome that, because to me it's richer and deeper. So it's interesting. I think in some ways I'm different from those that call themselves Baptists, but yet that's my home, and that's my family of origin in terms of my faith. Most of the people that I see are people that I see that because of my pastoral identity. I'm a member of the AAPC, which is the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, which means that we in our organization have theological education. We also have clinical training. So mine is as an ordained Baptist minister, and I'm also licensed as a marriage and family therapist. So I'm a LMFT, as well as a pastoral counselor.
You have a lot of letters.
I know.
A lot of letters.
I know it is. That's a long time to get all those letters too. How much more time? Because can I take a bathroom break?
Yes, please do.
And it's for families that have been impacted by death, and we offer a group care for. And I work with the adults, and I have a social worker who works with the children, and we provide art and different venues for the expression of their grief. So anyway, it's those kinds of experiences. And I also offer a group that's called The Unwanted Gift of Grief.
I saw the poster.
Yeah, which fits in with my own theology in that the gift is in walking through the valley that most people want to avoid.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think that does to actually go through that process?
I think it opens windows of the soul that, had you not gone through that process, you never would have experienced. Mm-hmm. You know, I've heard cancer patients say, this is hard to even imagine, that they were thankful for their cancer because it was in that experience. By the way, cancer is all over my family. My sister died of sarcoma. Brenda, the middle child, had a double mastectomy, and my dad is a prostate cancer survivor, and my mom had a double mastectomy. So of the 5 people in my nuclear family, I'm the only one that doesn't have cancer. So I get my PSA checked regularly, and I go to my doctor on a regular basis. But what was interesting, when I talked to my internist about cancer in my family, he said my daughter really is actually more at risk than I am. Isn't that interesting?
Why? Because
of my sister's cancer and my mother, who is her. It's because of my daughter's aunt and grandmother. She's actually more at risk than I am.
Wow. That's interesting.
I didn't realize that.
Well, tell me, now that we're on the subject matter, your own feelings about mortality and your own feelings about maybe death in the afterlife, you know, and compared to the if you could actually maybe just give me a Reader's Digest version of what your church teaches, and then let me know if that's cognizant with your belief.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. That's a really deep question.
Oh. Thank you.
Did you come with that question?
Yeah, just now.
I believe in life after death. Okay. I believe that I believe in life after this life, and what that means is that the spiritual part of our being lives after the physical body dies. About, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I preached at the funeral of my brother-in-law, and that was one of the things that I said at the funeral, was that which is a part of my belief system, that I felt comfort in knowing that Scott, who died, was at peace because he had a relationship with God, and I felt comfort in knowing that 2 things. One is that he was not in any pain or sorrow, because he went through a lot of pain with his prostate cancer. And 2 is that his soul was at peace and rest. And one of the things I said at the funeral, and I really do believe that, I said every one of us in this room will eventually die. And I'm attentive to that because I work with couples that are diagnosed with cancer, and I work a lot with people that are in aging. But one of the things that the ritual of the worship experience can do is it can help us reevaluate and reassess our own lives and remind us of our own mortality. So I do believe in life after this life.
Do you think the specifics of the life after this life are in line with what your church teaches? And what does your church teach?
Yeah, I would say they pretty much in line. Now, here's what might be a fine line is I think probably I'm a little bit more open-minded than the average within my denomination. And, you know, I think there's some in my denomination that are pretty narrow and selective in how they think about what that will look like. It's a very complex question. Yeah. Because what do you say to the Hindu, or what do you say to the Buddhist who believes and has their faith? I mean, you've interviewed people from that tradition.
Right.
By the way, can I have a copy of what you
yes.
you research and what you write up?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I want to have a copy.
Okay. And do you want a copy of this now?
Oh, that'd be great.
Okay.
Are you gonna have someone transcribe this?
Some poor person's gonna have to do it.
There's not a program that does that, is there?
There is, but very primitive at this point. So, yeah.
So to answer your question, there are some that are pretty dogmatic and I guess you'd say more conservative. Of course, you have to take seriously the words of Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me." So I wrestle with that as a Christian. You know, what does the Hindu believe, or what does, of course, the Jewish faith would say that the Messiah is yet to come. So I don't know. There's a lot of that. There's a lot about that I quite honestly I don't know.
Have you ever had any experiences, either yourself with, or people that you know that have had any kind of afterlife experiences? Near-death experiences?
No. No. Now I've heard stories of people, that see a light and that kind of thing.
I was just wondering, in your grief counseling work, if that never comes up.
No, not that I'm recalling right now.
Where do you see the future of the Baptist denomination headed? And if you could get your crystal ball out.
I have no idea. It's a wonderful question. I think folks today these younger people, they have no loyalty to any kind of denomination whatsoever.
Denomination is okay.
Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, these younger folks could care less. And so I don't know what's going to...
How do you feel about that?
Well, there's a part about that I don't like. That they find themselves drawn to a style of worship or a body of believers. And I have mixed feelings about that, because what does it say about the theology of that particular group? And there's a value in the traditions, the faith traditions. There's a value to that. So I don't know. I know some in the Baptist tradition, when they are marketing their congregation, they leave out the word Baptist.
Really?
As a way to appeal to more people. And some of that might be, I think, because of the bad connotation that some have of Baptist folks.
What do you think of the prosperity gospel?
Oh gosh, I can't stand it.
Now
you thought I'd say that, didn't you?
Well, given your background, it was kind of a loaded question.
I can't stand it. Oh, it just grieves me. how can someone think like that?
Mm-hmm.
But it's out there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big one. It's a
Oh,
big
it is.
nowadays.
It is big.
Yeah.
It is big.
So
Now, did you come up with that question?
I was just thinking about it because I was thinking about what you said about when you were younger and how you were thinking that your family had a lot of excess.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the prosperity gospel now is huge.
Right. It is big.
So let me ask you this: tithing after tax or before tax?
I believe all is of God. I believe all we have is of God's.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just stewards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the way I believe.
Sharing. What would you most want others to understand about your faith and about yourself in your relation to your faith?
I guess I would want them to know that there was a sincerity about it, and that there was an openness about it. I value openness and sincerity.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also applied. It wasn't just words. It was, it had feet to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
And in regards to your parents, are they both still
Mm-hmm.
living?
And they have significant aging issues and medical issues. And my mother-in-law, we're going to visit her this afternoon in South Carolina. She's 80, let's see, born 22, 89, and she has significant aging issues. So we have 3 aging parents, 2 in Louisiana and 1 in South Carolina, that we're very attentive to, and more to my mother-in-law in South Carolina. My wife's probably there every 3 weeks or so.
And does she have a faith community there?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
And she's very active in her faith.
So
community.
it's just your parents that
Right.
have.
Right.
Yeah. Do you worry about them in terms of their salvation? So you think they're good to go?
Oh yeah. I don't worry about that.
Yeah. And one other, I don't think we touched upon this. In your faith, did you say, in addition to being baptized, was that the big formality? Did you say the prayer to give your heart to Jesus? I know a lot of Baptists do that. Was that part of your
I don't know if that was part. Now sometimes before. Have you ever seen a baptism?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And sometimes the minister will say, "Who do you believe?" or "What is your?" I don't know how they say it, but anyway, who do you believe is your eternal Redeemer? And then the person that's baptized says Jesus Christ, and then they baptize them. I don't know. I don't remember anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember anything.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you want to say? I think we're kind of coming to the
This
end
is
of
fascinating.
This. Oh, it's very
I'd be
fascinating.
curious what other people. I'm curious, how has the interview with me been similar to and different from others that you have interviewed?
One of the things that I have found is that most of the people that I've interviewed have come from faith communities.
Uh-huh.
So I'm not talking about getting people off the street, which eventually I would like to do.
Mm-hmm.
So these are people that were all raised in particular communities, and as they got older, they stayed in faith communities, and that's been very interesting to me. I think
They didn't leave the.
Some of them, I actually interviewed some people that converted from Christianity to Islam.
Wow.
And those were all, what surprised me about those most was the seamlessness of their conversion and their continuing respect and love for Christianity. And I think that's a lot of things, that's one thing that's very misunderstood about Islam, is that they did consider Jesus a prophet, just not the last prophet, but they have great respect for him. One of the things that has been fascinating to me also, one of the similarities is a focus on doing, a focus on personal responsibility, as opposed to just wanting, God to come and tell them to do everything. A real focus on personal responsibility, especially you know, I had a Hindu man and a Muslim man. I mean, it was almost verbatim exactly the same thing, where they each said to me, you know, much of our faith is, you know, taking responsibility for your actions and doing something with your life, you know, doing something with this brain that God gave you. It was very, very
cool.
interesting. And then the other thing is how people's, you cannot separate life from faith. How everyone interweaves these stories with their personal experiences, and how their personal experiences have, you know, they go hand in hand with their faith journey, and they're completely wrapped up together. So, you know, some people, it may have been the civil rights movement. You know, for you, it was the experience of the infertility,
right? And
how these influence the trajectory of someone's religious faith. The other thing too, and you wonderfully actually answered this before even being asked, is we ask about people that were influential in your life. And it comes up time and time again that these influential people you see as people get older, they end up being so much like the influential person in their life. That's so I'm really seeing, and to tell you the truth, I'm seeing more similarities than differences. And I think a lot of it that has been really wonderful for me is everyone has been open and heartfelt and sincere.
That's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very nice.
And have you remained Catholic?
Yes. Yeah.
Bless you.
Cradle. Let's say cradle to
But
cradle.
you know what's interesting, talking about infertility, some of the couples that have the most challenge are from a Catholic tradition. Because you know there's shame, and well, some priests would not encourage any kind of reproductive technology.
Wow.
Whereas some are more open. And then I know we had a seminar here, and it was several years ago, and we had different clergy come in. It was the Catholic group that was the most unsettled. They were the couples that participated were very upset because of what that particular priest had to say about reproductive technology. So it's an interesting topic among the different denominations in terms of how people think about that.
Well, I believe in Catholicism too, because you have more of a hierarchy than some of the other faiths.
Right.
That the priests and the bishops and the cardinals,
well, see, that
the Pope, they carry a lot more weight.
Yeah, and see, that would be when I speak of the priest of the believer. That's all. I mean, that's part of the Protestant protesting. That is a part of my tradition. That the priest of the believer would protest as a Protestant against the hierarchy. Which for me as a believer, I value the priest of the believer because I have access, and so that's something that I value.
Yes, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I just have to get a little bit of demographic information.
Yeah, let me give you my card too.
Okay. And some of this we've already gone over, so just bear with me. I have to put this at the end of the interview. Your current occupation?
I am a pastoral counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Okay, and how do you describe your ethnicity?
I'm Caucasian.
Okay, and your educational background?
I have a doctorate in pastoral counseling, and I'm licensed as a marriage and family therapist.
Okay. And you are married, and you have one daughter,
One
correct?
daughter.
And what is your current religious affiliation?
Baptist.
Baptist. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. This was great.
Thank you for your time.